All right, back in the trig review, our feature tonight is graphs of trig functions. Let's begin our graphing section by identifying the parent graphs for sine and cosine, and they each have a period of 2 pi. So by definition, the period of a sinusoidal function is, and this has been a big theme on these tests we've been taking, the period is how long it takes to complete one cycle. I'm going to call it one full cycle. Okay, so if you haven't figured out period's important, then you're probably screwing up most of these trig questions. How long it takes to complete one cycle. Now you'll notice we just said each of these have a period of 2 pi. Well, let's look at the graphs. One cycle of the sine curve, so get it sketched, is a hump above and a hump below, and it should end at 2 pi. That is one full cycle. Then we'll graph cosine in your notebook, and one full cycle of cosine should end at 2 pi. It starts high, hits its min in the middle, and then ends high. This is one full cycle of cosine, one full cycle of sine. If the value b changes, then the number of cycles from 0 to 2 pi will change as well. By definition, the frequency of a sinusoidal curve is how many cycles you see at 2 pi. Okay, so you'll notice the b value here is a 1 because I see one cycle at 2 pi. The b value here is a 1 because I see one cycle at 2 pi. So we've got 4 sketches here, and it says determine if each of the following is the cosine function or the sine function, and then determine if the leading coefficient is positive or negative. So determining whether they're sine or cosine is pretty straightforward. It just depends where they start. So if I start at the origin, your gut should be saying this is the sine function. And then determining where I went from the origin, up or down, tells me if my leading coefficient is positive or negative. So since this function went down first, I would say this is a negative sine function. If I go to the right here, at the origin, the graph is starting at its max, which means this is the cosine function. And it's starting where it normally should, which is at its max, which means it's a positive cosine function. Now, the next graph is a little trickier because the midline is not at the origin. So let's figure out exactly where the midline is, kind of a quick review. To find the midline, you take the average of the max and the min. So we all know how to find averages, we just reviewed stats. What is your maximum height? Looks like that's a height of 5, and your minimum height is a height of 1. So I'm going to say 5 plus 1, those are two numbers divided by 2, so that 6 divided by 2 is 3. My midline should be at 3, and then you should draw that in. Now, how do you know if you're right about your midline? Well, the max and the min should be the same distance away. The max is 2 blocks above, the min is 2 blocks below. Therefore, I know I'm right. So now I go right back to my origin, which is now the midline. Okay, I'm pretending this is my new origin, and I'm saying, is the function starting at the midline, or is it starting above or below? It's definitely starting below, so I know this is the cosine function. And since it's starting below, that makes this the negative cosine function. Next graph is pretty nice because, again, this midline is where it's supposed to be, so I'm just going to draw it in for myself. You'll notice that the function starts right at the origin, therefore it's the sine function, and it goes in the direction it's supposed to first, up, so it's the positive sine function. Alright, so let's get into some heavy-duty graphs here. Now, we've been getting killed on reading on these tests, and I keep stressing, words are italicized for a reason. This clearly says graph 2 cycles, not 1, not 3, not 5, graph 2 cycles of this function from 0 to 2 pi. Now you'll notice nothing's labeled. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sketch my axis, my y-axis over here, my x in the middle, and I'm going to make sure I count out from 0 to 2 pi. Now they just have to be evenly spaced, so I'm going to go every 3 blocks or so. So pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Okay, so the first thing I do is kind of set up my grid. Now you're crazy if you don't identify all the players. That's the whole point of the game. So the first thing you want to find is the amplitude, okay, which is the absolute value of A, the number in front. My A is 1, so I have a positive 1. My frequency, okay, is my B value with the X. So my frequency is 2 at 2 pi. So if I'm graphing from 0 to 2 pi, I need to see 2 whole cycles of the cosine curve. I need to see 2 at 2 pi. Now to me, the most important thing when graphing is the period. Okay, so let's get period written out. The period is how long it takes to complete one cycle. So there's a formula for period, and we all know it's 2 pi over f. So in this case, my frequency was 2, which tells me that the first cycle should be completed at pi. So how does that help you graph? Well, I think it's a no-brainer. You have to draw the first cycle at pi. So back when we did this in our notes during class, I said sometimes it's helpful to draw in like this little vertical line, and this will tell you when your cycle ends. So since my period is pi, I'm going to lighten my yellow up here. I'm going to real lightly draw in a vertical line at pi. And I'm going to say to myself, the whole graph has to fit between 0 and pi. That's the whole point. You got to squeeze the whole graph in there. All right? And now lastly, we're just graphing cosine. So I know I'm going to start at my max, end at my max, smack in the middle, I'm going to be at my min, and then in between I'm going to hit real nicely. Now, what is my max? Well, my amplitude is 1. So again, I'm just going to space these out by 3s. There's my 1 and my 2, -1, -2. Okay, so here I go. I'm going to start at my max. I'm going to end at my max. Smack in the middle, I'm going to be at my min. Okay, now you remember you have to have 5 points plotted. We've talked about graphing a lot in review. 5 points plotted. Now smack in the middle here, I should hit the x-axis, and smack in the middle here, I should hit the x-axis. And I want to make one nice smooth curve of cosine. So remember, period, the most important thing about graphing, tells you when the cycle ends. Now, the frequency just says you should see 2 of them at 2 pi, and I think that should make sense. If you see 1 at pi, you should see 2 at 2 pi. So I'm basically going to repeat this cycle as I draw the next one. So I start at my max, I end at my max, smack in the middle, I hit my min, and between those I cross my x-axis. 5 equally plotted points. All right, let's try another one. So let's watch those italicized words. Graph one cycle. Okay, not 10, 1 of this function. So let's pull out some players. The amplitude is 3. That means my max and my min are going to go 3. Now, look how they wrote the frequency. Yuck. All right, they have it as a fraction. No big deal, guys. What number is in front of theta? Okay, obviously it says divided by 2, but what number is in front of theta? Well, there's always 1 theta over 2. So what fraction do you see? 1/2. So rewrite it. It's really 1/2 theta. Therefore, your frequency is 1/2, and remember that's how many you should see at 2 pi. Now let's get the most important one, the period. The period is 2 pi divided by the frequency. Okay, so a little algebra review. Keep, change division to multiplication, flip this fraction. My period is 4 pi. So you should not see the entire graph until you get to 4 pi. This is one cycle. One cycle should happen at 4 pi. All right, now let's look at what we're graphing from, 0 to 4 pi. So let's get our axes on here. All right, I have to, let's see, my amplitude was 3, so I know I have to count up and down to 3. So again, I'm going to go every 3 blocks just to space it out. So that's 1, 2, 3. 1, -1, -2, -3. Okay, now I get a little sneaky on the x-axis. I have to count to 4 pi. So typically we count to 2 pi. It's very simple. We're just going to count to 4 pi. So I'm going to go, there's my pi over 2. There's 1 pi. 3 pi over 2. 2 pi. Okay, now, if you're not sure what the next tick mark is, I want you to think about this. This was 1 over 2. This is actually 2 over 2, which made pi. 3 over 2. This is 4 over 2, which made 2 pi. What do you think the next tick mark is? 5 pi over 2. 6 pi over 2, which makes 3 pi. I'm going to extend mine out a little bit. 7 pi over 2. And then guess what the next one is? 8 pi over 2, which makes 4 pi. We're literally counting by 1 pi over 2 each time. 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2. They cancel and make pi. 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2, 2 pi, etc. So how does this help us? Well, you aren't going to see the entire graph until you get to 4 pi. So from here to here is going to make one big cycle. So since it's sine, it's going to start at the origin, and it's going to end at the origin at 4 pi. That's where my cycle ends. Smack in the middle, it should hit the origin. Well, the middle between 0 and 4 pi would be 2 pi. In between each of those, it's going to have a max, so the max would be at pi. And in between each of these two, it'll have a min, which will be at 3 pi. And then we'll make our nice smooth curve, and we'll say, did I do it correct? Do I have half a cycle at 2 pi? Well, here's 2 pi. Do I only see half the cycle? Check, that's correct. Do I see one full cycle at 4 pi? That's correct. So we know we did it. All right, hopefully 2 easy questions here. State the range and the equation of the midline for each group. All right, so it looks like my maximum is -1. My minimum is -5. So I need to find my midline, which remember is just the average. Average means takes your max and min, add them, and divide by 2. So I would say my midline should be at -3. Let's draw it in and double check. 2 above, 2 below, bam, you know you're in the middle. So did I state my range? My range are my y values, low to high, -5 to -1 is my range. And the equation of the midline, it's horizontal, so that's y equals, -3. All right, let's try the next one. What's my max value? Looks like a 4. My min value, a -6. So 4 plus -6 divided by 2. That's -2 over 2, -1. Let's get it graphed and see if we agree. Does it look like that line's in the middle? Well, let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 above. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 below. We nailed it. So the equation of that midline is y equals -1. My range, remember, always go low to high, -6 to +4. All right. So again, I tried to make each of these a little more difficult. Graph one cycle of cosine, so we can do that. It has to be cosine. Amplitude is 3, so similar to what we just did. Amplitude is 3. Now the period is pi over 2. My midline is y equals -1 and passes through the point 0, 2. So they already gave me the period, so I'm going to go straight to my midline. I have to start at y equals -1, so let me get this grid. 1, 2, 3, -1, -2, -3. All right, so y equals -1. Let's get that drawn in first. This is where my midline should be. My period is pi over 2, which means I have to see one cycle when I get to pi over 2. So let's put our tick marks on. Here's pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. My first cycle ends at pi over 2, so I'm going to get my light yellow out. Okay, and I'm going to draw in that vertical line to remind myself this is where the cycle has to end. I have to see this first whole cycle between 0 and pi over 2. So because it's cosine, I'm going to start at my amplitude. So if I go up 3, 1, 2, 3, that puts me magically at 0, 2, which is what I had to go through. I know I'm going to end at my amplitude. Smack in the middle, I'm going to be at my minimum value, so I have to go down 3, which is actually going to put me at -4, smack in the middle. And then directly in the middle of those is where I'll hit my x-axis. So hopefully your graph looks like this. Now remember, it said one cycle, so don't graph more than that, just one complete cycle. All right, let's talk through one more. This time it says graph 2 cycles. So the first thing I want to identify is that this is a cosine function. My amplitude is 3. I have a vertical shift. That's where my midline is going to be. And that's at y equals -2. My frequency looks ugly, but remember, that's just 1/2 of x. So my frequency is 1/2, which means my period is 2 pi over 1/2, which is really 2 pi times 2, so my period is actually 4 pi. So I'm not going to see that whole cycle till I get out to 4 pi. So again, I'm going to start with my midline and draw that in. So I'm going to go down 2, and I'm going to draw my midline in. So that's like my new x-axis. We said the amplitude is 3, and of course I got to label my points here. So I'm going to go pi over 2 pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. Now, all of a sudden I realized that's not the best scale because I got to get out to 4 pi. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to grab my eraser, and oh dear, it's not going to let me erase. Let's see if I can undo those. And I'm going to get rid of those. And instead of counting by pi over 2, I'm going to count by pi. Whoops. So I'm going to say this is 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. Because I'm not going to see the whole cycle till I get out to 4 pi. Now here's the other catch, is I had to sketch 2 cycles. Okay, so I'm not going to see the whole thing until I get out to 4 pi, which means I won't see 2 of them until I get out to 8 pi. So there's my 5 pi, 6 pi, 7 pi, and lastly 8 pi. So I'm going to go get my highlighter again, and I'm going to mark off where my period is. I'm going to see the whole cycle at 4 pi, and then I won't see the next cycle happen between 4 pi and 8 pi. Okay, so since this was cosine, we're starting at our max, which is 3. So 3 up from the amplitude. Because it's cosine, it's also going to end at its max. Smack in the middle, it should be at its min, 1, 2, 3. And directly in between those two is where it's going to hit the x-axis. It's 0 or roots. And I'm going to make one nice curve there. And then because it said sketch 2, I'm going to repeat that cycle. So it's going to start at its max, end at its max, in the middle be at its min, and then hit in between there. So you can see we've graphed 2 cycles of this function. My midline was at -2, amplitude is 3, period is 4 pi. Well, I think that does it for our graphing review, and we'll get some great practice tomorrow. Have a good night.